John Wesley was born roughly 9 months after the end of a political argument between his parents. Think about that. So even his conception, you could say, was tinged with controversy. The controversy was about who should be king, right? Should it be William III or should it be James II? William had come to the throne through his wife Mary. Through the so-called Glorious Revolution, the Protestants named it glorious. The Catholics never did, as you might imagine. And that Glorious Revolution ushered James II out of the country and put two distant Protestant cousins on the throne of England for almost no other reason than the fact that they were Protestant. But this left a problem for Susanna Wesley. She was a Jacobite, which meant that she, feeling as though that she had given her fealty and loyalty to the Stuart line, as in James II, could not pledge fealty and loyalty to another king because her king was still alive, even if he was exiled in France. Samuel Wesley, on the other hand, although a good Tory, he was kind of a staunch Tory, although we have found that he split his vote every once in a while to make people happy. Never hear about that anymore, do we? But he saw the benefits of the Glorious Revolution for the church and for the Protestant cause, and so he felt as though he could support King William. So, but what happened? So that's the setup. There's the fight. You had a Jacobite wife, and you had a Tory who was able to plug his nose long enough to support the current monarch, essentially. So here's the problem. Susanna wouldn't say amen at the end of prayers for the king. So after this, she was wonderfully stubborn. So after this went on for a while, Samuel looked at her and he said, "Suki," which is what he called her, "if we are to have two kings, we shall have two beds." And so he left the Epworth Rectory for London, and he gave charge of his church to a curate, and he stayed in London for a year. It's really quite something. These were emotional people. I know we think of the English as being not as emotional as Americans are. That's post-Victorian England. 18th century England, they were very emotional people. And so here's Samuel Wesley storming off, leaving his wife and children, because he did have a few by that time, in Epworth to essentially stay in the house while he went off to London. Now, so skipping over a few of the finer details, John Wesley, as I said earlier, was the result of the end of political hostilities between Samuel and Susanna. It also helped that now Anne was Queen of England, and they could finally agree to both support Queen Anne. All right, so what's the date for John Wesley's birth? 1703, June 17th, if we're using the old calendar, June 28th, if you're using the calendar that we happen to be on now. This always confuses people, especially on Facebook, when they try to say, "Happy birthday, John Wesley," which every good Methodist does, right? In the 1750s, well, for the longest time, the English thought that the calendar that we're on now was really a Catholic plot. I'm serious. Yeah, I know. And so they refused to align with the new calendar because they thought the Catholics were just trying to do something. They didn't know what, but they were trying to do something with the calendar. But by the 1750s, the English finally came in line with the rest of Europe, and they lost 11 days. And so from that point on, John Wesley actually celebrated his birthday on June 28th. So the moral there is you can have a birthday party for him on both days, and it's fine. John Wesley would not be the first John born to the Wesleys. And by the way, I'm going to get rid of one myth. His middle name was not Benjamin. Some people say, I've seen plaques in churches to John Benjamin Wesley. John Benjamin Wesley died in infancy. John Wesley, founder of Methodism, had no middle name. But he was one of a couple Johns. They just kept naming the children the same thing when others would die. As you know, Samuel and Susanna had 19 children. 9 lived to maturity, 3 boys and 6 girls. John Wesley was the second boy to survive, and Charles was the youngest. And I could tell you about the the Wesley girl, that's a whole nother lecture. That's a sad lecture. The Wesley girls. One of them's buried with John Wesley, so when you visit his grave, make sure you go all the way around it and read the different names, because one of the sisters is buried in the grave with him. But that's some homework for curious Methodists if you want to see the sad story of the Wesley girls. So the Wesley home, which I have behind me, although notice that I've got after 1709, right? That's because this is the rebuild. It burned in 1709, right? We have the great story of John Wesley being saved and later claiming he was a brand plucked from the burning, right? He also used that one time when he was with a woman and he was overcome with emotion and saved from his feelings when somebody came and he was a brand plucked from the burning. In other words, he wanted to kiss the girl, but he felt guilty about it. But we'll get to that later. That happened in Georgia. It was a strict home in Lincolnshire, but I would argue one full of love. Sometimes we get this picture of a strict home being, just a strict home, but that's not the case. Both parents taught the children, not just Susanna. Both of them taught the children, and they taught the boys and the girls to read. All of the children were to begin learning to read. They learned the alphabet on their birthday when they turned 5. I do like one of the reasons that Susanna gives for teaching the girls how to read is because she was tired of women not being able to read the lessons in church. And I thought, look at that. She wanted them to participate in the life of the church. And if you've ever been to an Anglican service, the multiple readings of Scripture, she wanted her girls to be able to do that. In fact, she actually argued that she would train her girls how to read before she would teach them how to sew. Little tinges of feminism in Susanna Wesley, although calling her a feminist really isn't accurate, but still. Okay. Samuel and Susanna were both converts to the Church of England. They both grew up in prominent dissenting or nonconformist homes. And in fact, Susanna Wesley's, so it would be Susanna Annesley Wesley. Her father was a very prominent dissenting minister. Now, does everybody know what a dissenting person is? Okay. So you had the official established Church of England, right? They weren't necessarily called Anglican at that point. That's more of a 19th century term. But they were simply the establishment. And that was at the beginning of the century, roughly probably 95% of the population were Church of England. If you were a Trinitarian Protestant, there are caveats here, Trinitarian Protestant who could not sign the dotted line with what it meant to be in the established church, you were allowed to be a dissenter, meaning obviously you dissented from the state church. That put you in a second class, you were essentially a second class citizen. And you'll see over there, look for old congregational churches or Baptist churches. If they're 17th century, even some 19th century, you'll notice they're not along the street. They're back off of the street. They don't have steeples. They don't look like churches. They're built off in the distance. And these were some of the stipulations that they had to follow in order to be licensed as a dissenting group. Charles Wesley, by the way, spent his entire life making sure Methodists were never dissenters, ever. In fact, he told a friend once, I would rather see thee smiling in thy coffin than to see thee a dissenter. He was very passionate. All right, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Dissenters. So both Samuel and Susanna Wesley come from dissenting, you could say congregationalist if that's easier, dissenting homes. And they had memories of what was called the Great Ejection, which is 1660. When, if you couldn't sign the dotted line on the prayer book that was instituted in 1660 and 1662, you were essentially removed from your appointment. So if Tom couldn't sign the dotted line on the book of worship, right, which we don't force that kind of thing, but anyway, and he was ejected from his appointment and had to go elsewhere. What's interesting about this for the Wesleys is that both of John Wesley's grandfathers were ejected from their livings. And so you have this tradition of these proud dissenters And then all of a sudden, Samuel and Susanna, while they're teenagers, because of their study, they wanted to study, why am I dissenting? As they studied it more and more, they actually converted to the Church of England. And like most converts, they had a passion for it. And you see that throughout the lives of Susanna and Samuel Wesley. So what you see, I think, with the Wesley home, and I'm going to argue about combining things. You'll hear this a lot tonight. This is what Wesley does. It's never either or. It's always, almost always both and with Wesley. You'll see that if you keep reading some of his works. But at the Wesley home, what's the combination? Well, it's this the eagerness of the Anglican convert together with the devotional heritage of the Puritans. And if you want to find some of the most beautiful devotional literature in English, it comes from the Puritans. So, what did this mean for the children? Well, it meant that they were raised with a very strict approach to religion. In fact, they were taught to cry quietly, if at all. It's one of the lines that Susanna used. Okay, so what happened? John was sent, as were all the Wesley boys, to boarding school. This is just what they did. And this is Charterhouse, London. This is where John went. Samuel Jr. and Charles went to the Westminster School, which is actually still a school. Charterhouse is no longer a school and actually was never even founded to be a school. It just opened. I actually took that picture. I'm very proud of this. It just opened for public tours last year, and I happened to be over there and was able to get into some parts of it. It's actually now, it's interesting. It's kind of a monastic retirement home, if you can describe something like that. But look that up. That's something to see. It's right near Aldersgate and St. Paul's. Anyway, this is Charterhouse School, where John Wesley went to school. Not too much of interest happened with John when he was in school at Charterhouse, although he does describe the older boys stealing the meat from the younger boys. He complains about this in letters home. He does say that he sinned away the grace of his baptism, although I can't imagine what he was able to do to sin away the grace of his baptism. And knowing John Wesley, it was something very dull. It's funny, though, because we have some letters between the parents and John. And they tell him to get exercise. And so he would run around the school. And so as I was there, the school is it's the right half of that picture. I'm just picturing little John Wesley, running around the school for exercise right there in the middle of London. All right, so he left Charterhouse and he went up to Oxford. You're going to Oxford, you never go over or down. Everybody goes up to Oxford. It's one of those little quirks about Oxford. And he went to Christ Church. Samuel Sr., so Dad went to Exeter College. Samuel Jr., John, and Charles all went to Christ Church. And I put the Tom Tower there for a reason. The bell in that tower, given its size in the 18th century, that was the loudest sound that John Wesley ever heard, was the ringing of that particular bell. So when you're there, hopefully they'll ring the bell for you. It is a massive sound. But just know that, in fact, that was the loudest sound he ever heard. I think it's at Oxford that Wesley comes to his own, and I think this is where the story becomes interesting. Now, you might imagine, for those of you who know anything about Wesley, he was a fastidious student. Very much so. In fact, I hate to break it to modern Methodists, but we probably wouldn't like John Wesley personally. Charles probably, but John might be difficult to deal with. He excelled in Greek and logic. Those are the two things in undergrad I hated most, by the way. I think it's so funny that as a Wesley scholar, those were the two classes in undergrad I couldn't stand. But because of his excelling academically and otherwise, he went on to become a fellow, in other words, a professor of Lincoln College. And he taught Greek and logic as a fellow, as a tutor, at Lincoln College. And I'm sure you'll see that too. They have a number of Wesley things at Lincoln College. There's still debate, though, as to which rooms were actually his. So here's a key to England. Don't believe every plaque you read. All right. But it's at Oxford that, in his own words, he took a turn towards seriousness. This is the term they all used when they said they're becoming more religious. It took a turn towards seriousness. He became a more committed Christian. And this was a repercussion of the work of High Church Caroline divines. Let me unpack that. I'll define High Church in a second, but the Caroline divines, so Caroline having to do with King Charles I, King Charles II, divines, theologians. This is why at the seminary we give out Masters of Divinity, right? It's the old English way of talking about theology. I like to tell my students that we're making them Master Divinity, and that they can claim that once they graduate. But the Caroline divines were 17th century High Church theologians. These are the people that really shape John Wesley while he's a student at Oxford. And I have formatting's off a little bit. But anyway, the Caroline divines, I've given you two names, the most influential on him, Jeremy Taylor and William Law. William Law really shaped him in terms of his understanding of holiness, and so did Jeremy Taylor. But what's fascinating about Jeremy Taylor is that he's the one who got Wesley to start writing a journal. We have the journal and we have the diary. We have more, actually, this is an interesting tidbit about Wesley. We have more primary material on John Wesley than any other figure in church history. You could look up what he was doing at 4 o'clock on a certain day of his life and probably find out. Now, being English, he was probably having tea at 4 o'clock. But the journal was a public document written to tell people what he was up to. But the diary is this hour-by-hour reckoning of everything he did that day. And we have most of those still. You can read that to your heart's content. All right, Oxford, though, another thing that's important is that Oxford, at that point, and probably still, was bathed in Aristotelianism. So, bringing back Philosophy 101, is this a real stand or is it not? Right? Bring back nightmares for some people with those kind of questions, right? The question was always, right, is this a real table or is it not? In the school of Plato, it's not real, right? Nothing tangible is real. It's only a form of the real. But for the Aristotelian, this is not only a table that's real, it's perfect. This is important. I'm not just leading you down a rabbit hole. It's perfect because it functions as table perfectly. It's holding my coffee perfectly. Think about that later as we talk about Christian perfection. It was never a static Platonic perfection. It was perfection as in, does it function as it's supposed to function? All right, we'll get to Christian perfection in a minute, though. This is also where John Wesley, and I'm just trying to help you understand his thought and how important Oxford was. He fell in love with what he termed primitive Christianity. We would call it the early church. In fact, he became so enamored with primitive Christianity that became his nickname. So his friends actually called him Primitive Christianity. John Wesley actually had a couple nicknames. We don't think, most people think, oh my gosh, Wesley would never have nicknames. Yeah, he did. Primitive Christianity was probably the most interesting one, but his family called him Jack or Jackie. All right, so what does it mean to be high church? Well, it doesn't mean to be, covered in lace and surrounded by the smell of incense, which might be the case today. In fact, in the 18th century, no Englishman would be caught dead celebrating Mass or wearing chasubles and all the rest of that high church stuff, nor using incense. To be high church at this point meant to be immersed and influenced by the writings of the church fathers. So that was the key to understanding what was high church. And so for Wesley, for the rest of his life, after he kind of dabbles in the church fathers at Oxford, he's just enamored by them. And specifically, the pre-Nicene church fathers. So the ones before 325, before the Great Council of Nicaea, 325. I can give you some names if you want to go reading. It's Macarius, Athanasius, and Irenaeus are probably the three most influential on John Wesley. What he liked about the early church, he liked the early church's disciplines. So not only its discipline, but its practices. He loved its liturgy, and he loved its communal structure. And so he tried, in fact, to replicate this throughout the rest of his life. I think that's one of the keys to understanding John Wesley. All right, so it's with all these influences I've given you that we see what is called the first rise of Methodism, right? There it is. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to tell you what that picture was. Oh, it won't go back. There it is. That's the chapel in Lincoln College. And it's particularly interesting not only because John Wesley sat there, he sat all over the place, so that's not particularly interesting. But he did worship there on a regular basis. And it's designed exactly according to the wishes of the Caroline Divines. So it was a return to the emphases of the Caroline Divines in architecture. And this is a perfect example of what's called a Laudian approach to architecture. You'll notice that the altar is in the middle. It's not the pulpit. It's got very specific choir stalls. It's almost monastic the way it looks. So they're trying to recapture some of the more Catholic elements without being too Catholic. All right? That's what that is. All right, so first rise of Methodism. The Holy Club or the Methodists, right? So John Wesley had graduated from Christ Church and, as I said, was a tutor at Lincoln. Charles was a student at Christ Church. And he had his own turn towards seriousness. And it's kind of interesting. They found one deist in Oxford, and everybody had a fit. And they launched this whole campaign. They were horrified by the idea of one deist. I think it's fascinating to see that an entire university kind of shift on the discovery of one deist. But anyway, what they did in terms of this holy club, and by the way, this is not an accurate picture, they formed themselves with like-minded persons. Okay? Or I should say, like-minded men. Sorry, ladies. It's all men at this point. And at first, this is hardly a religious society. In fact, it's arguably a homework club. They wanted to keep each other accountable to do what they're supposed to do as students. And so they did this, and they studied together. But it grew to include other things. You have some influential people in here. William Morgan pressed the group to do aesthetic practices of the faith, so in other words, fasting and prayer and things of that nature. And then John Clayton, he's key. He brought in the dual emphasis of constant communion and working with the poor. So that, what we think of as a very Methodist influence, actually came from a man named John Clayton and his influence on John Wesley. All right, so the group grew, but so did their notoriety. Piety of a unique form was not welcome in post-Restoration England, and the Methodists were called that because they were methodical. Their approach to accountability and the maintenance of virtues would face decades of opposition, something that I think most of us don't even think about. The reason they faced this opposition was because Wesleyan Methodism arose at a time when England was tired of religious conflict. There's all kinds of things. I can just rattle this off. You had the English Civil War. You had the execution of King Charles I. You had the Commonwealth under the Puritans, which was an utter failure, and not simply because they banned Christmas. You had the restoration of the monarchy. You had the Great Ejection. Then you had the Glorious Revolution. And all this had left the English with no stomach for what they called religious enthusiasm. We would call it zealotry, by the way. They'd call it enthusiasm. I know we're supposed to be enthusiastic now, but not in this way. And so they wanted to maintain, right? You hear the Pax Romana. They wanted the Pax Anglicana, right? Peace at all costs. And here you have these people doing what? Doing this methodical little thing of their small groups and going to communion too often and starting schools and who knows what they're up to. So the first time that the term Methodist is actually attached to the term Methodist is actually attached to this group in 1729. It was in a newspaper in London, and it was not meant as a compliment. It didn't help that William Morgan died because of the aesthetical practices that he himself introduced. And this was a big scandal. You can read about that in Wesley's journal. But the first rise of Methodism can, I think, best be understood as the development of small groups. There was more than just one group, by the way. To hold believers accountable as they progressed through the Christian life and in the development of virtue. All right, so Christ Church Cathedral, you'll see this in Oxford. The reason I bring this up, two reasons.
In the last picture?
Yeah.
Who's the sad guy at the right-hand side?
I don't know.
I thought there was a story there.
It might be. The reality is, they would have never been all together in that room like that. They probably met 5 or 6 at a time, and they had a number of groups throughout the colleges that spread. And so, yeah, this is a late 19th century propaganda piece. Sorry. Even the picture of saving John Wesley from the fire is a propaganda piece. The faces on the men saving him are actually contemporary Methodists who were trying to push reforms through a conference. And so the moral of the story is we are saving John Wesley again. So, yeah, you got to look at some of these things. It's fascinating. Okay, but Christ Church is not a propaganda piece. And this is where, there's a plaque on the floor, you'll see it. This is where John and Charles were both ordained. Charles was ordained a deacon here. John was ordained, I think, deacon and priest here. It's easy to remember the name of the bishop who ordained John Wesley, because it's at Christ Church where, when you go to the Tudor Dining Hall, you think of Harry Potter. He was ordained by Bishop Potter. Okay? But what's interesting about Christ Church, the cathedral, is that you'll see in the floor in the chancel, and this is 19th century, that Wesley's never saw it, but it's still interesting. They have the virtues in the floor. You know, it says like charity and fortitude, and it's the traditional virtues, right? And it's only in the chancel, and it leads directly to the altar. And what it is it's Oxford's view of Christianity in architecture. The practice of the virtues will lead you to Christ. And that's the way, if you're going to understand the first rise of Methodism, look at the floor in that cathedral. You'll be tempted to look up, because that's what cathedrals are, that's what you're supposed to do. But check out the floor, and I think that's a good way to look at it. It's not legalistic Christianity, but it took seriously the fact that you cannot separate faith and practice. Faith and practice go together, just like James said. All right, but the best practices, according to Wesley, were from the early church. Why? Because they were closest to Jesus. They were purists. He had this idea of purity. What were those? Constant communion, fasting, prayer, feeding poor and widows, and meditating on Scripture. But, all right, what happened? Well, Georgia was calling. And Georgia, I love this print because I actually have a framed one of this print. This is Savannah, 1735. You can actually see the squares are already laid out, by the way, if you look closely enough. But this is key to understanding some of the difficulties that John Wesley faced when he became the second rector of Savannah. The minister's house is the one furthest over to the left, out by the trees. It's actually beyond the line of that wall if you push the wall straight through. It kind of gives you an idea of what they thought of their ministers. Okay? So why did John Wesley want to go out there? Well, he got the missionary bug. He got it from his dad, by the way. Samuel Sr. wanted to be a missionary. But John wanted to go to Georgia to accomplish two things. One, he was really passionate. He wanted to convert the Indians, the Native Americans. Two, he wanted to plant a new colony as a beacon of primitive Christianity. This is this theme that keeps going through. So he grabbed some of his friends, including Charles, who I love to tell my students, this drives them crazy. John, within a week's time, pushed Charles through the ordination process. If you were to start the Methodist ordination process today, you might be an elder in 5 years. Maybe. So when I tell my students, the look on their face is just, well, whatever. Some of the joys, right? Okay, so he grabbed his friends, including his brother, and went to Georgia. This is what's called the second rise of Methodism. Because in Georgia, not only was John rector of Savannah, so the priest in charge of Savannah, but he started small groups. And he expected discipline from the inhabitants of this colonial outpost, which kind of went, yeah, maybe not so well. And even a few times he did preach to the Native Americans, although that was not to his liking at all. But, so what was Georgia? It was both a failure and a success. I've tried to explain this to people. Imagine a couple of Oxford dons lost in the woods, and you might understand the Georgia journey. So put your favorite professor out in the woods and kind of imagine how that would go. But what's interesting about it is that he ended up getting caught in the politics of the colony more so than we initially thought. There's been recent work that showed he got caught up in the politics because he stood up for who? The poor and for women. And he ended up entangled in some of the power struggles of the colony. Now, it also didn't help that he fell in and out of love with the magistrate's niece, Sophie Hopke. This is the one he was saved from, plucked from the burning. And when she married another man named Williamson, what did he do? You guys know? Banned her from communion. He could do that. It was legal, but it might not have been the smartest thing to do. So John Wesley actually left the Georgia colony as a wanted criminal because he ticked off the magistrate. But that's a whole other story. What Wesley wanted to do was to create a colony of primitive Christianity. And he even took on ultra-conservative liturgical practices, which drove people crazy.